We're going to start Module 2 now, which is all about data collection methods. Research hypothesis requires that you collect data and you analyze the data to determine the hypothesis conclusions. Likewise, research-related activities require that data for the protocol management and evaluation is collected. All collected data is interconnected with the stakeholders, such as the clinicians, the patients, the researchers, the study staff, etc. When you're using systems such as electronic medical records, case report forms, patient-reported outcome systems, or regulatory management and things like that, they all have to interconnect with the stakeholders. All the collected data can tell a story about any of these relationships and whether it can be between the researcher's aim or the research execution. Although the data can be valuable, too much information is unwieldy and the wrong data is useless. So the right data to be collected and the correct method can mean the difference between having useful insights and time-wasting misdirection. So before we go too much further, we kind of need to review the different types of data. There are three types of source data. Your primary data is collected by you or your participant. Your secondary data was collected by somebody else for an alternative purpose and is going to now be used for this. An example of this would be a retrospective data. And your tertiary data would be sources such as a review where you're going and looking at publications and you're going to summarize that information of the primary and secondary data together to provide some type of background information on a topic. The data that you collect come in two different forms. You can have quantitative data, which is where you're looking at the numbers and the quantities and the values, and this information describes things in a very concrete and easily measurable terms. Typically, when you're talking about quantitative data, you're going to be talking about experiments or clinical trials. You're going to be talking about lab results, observations and recordings that are very well defined with maybe the number of participants, or you might be talking about obtaining relevant data from a management information system, or you could even be administering close-ended surveys or questionnaires. You could do it through a face-to-face or telephone interviews, or there's different ways that you might administer those kinds of information. Because quantitative data is numeric and it's measurable, it usually lends itself very well to analytics. So when you analyze quantitative data, you might uncover insights that can help you better understand your research aim or how your protocol execution status might stand. And because quantitative data deals with numbers, it is very objective and has a reputation to being more reliable. However, quantitative data cannot work very far without qualitative data, which is your second type of data. Qualitative data is very descriptive rather than numbers. It's less concrete, it's less easily measurable, and it contains phrases and opinions, and it might be an open-ended survey questionnaire or a procedure, how people might feel about a procedure and things like that. Qualitative data is really important for giving you context behind the quantitative data. It explains the why behind the information the quantitative data reveals, and for this reason, it's usually used for supplemental quantitative data support. And it's going to form a foundation for your data strategy. So examples of this would be it describes your observations to provide meaning for the recorded numbers. It identifies the people that are involved in the study. It captures the relationships between the people and the data collection. It might describe the content of the study. It might describe specific activities involved in the research and how the message of the study is being delivered and received. Might illuminate facts about the study. Interaction with the study participants and interaction between the respondents and the research staff also can provide a lot of valuable information using qualitative data collection. Collect this information on external factors So you can have unanticipated events that affect your research outcomes, and the qualitative data collection methods allow for the researcher to identify these events and weave them into their results narrative, which is almost impossible to do with quantitative approach. There are lots of different methods for collecting data. So we're going to review the methods now and talk about those methods. One option is observation. When you're doing an observation method, you're collecting information by asking questions. And it's a much more subjective method of collecting data. It requires that the researcher or the observer have a judgment on the data, but in some circumstance, the risk or the bias can be minimal. So for example, if a study involves a number of people in a clinic at a given time, unless the observer counts incorrectly, the data should be reasonably reliable. And variables that require the observer to make distinctions, such as how many elderly people visit the clinic in a given period, those kinds of things can introduce potential problems. So in general, observation can determine the dynamics of a situation, which generally cannot be measured through other data collection techniques. Observation can also be combined with additional information, such as lab results. Another type of method for collecting data would be an interview, where you collect information in person, over video, or over the phone through chatting with somebody. In this case, the interview has a list of questions that can be tailored with follow-up questions based on a response in a real-time exchange. And the interviews allow for open-ended questions. Our third type of method for collecting data would be documents and records. In this case, you're collecting information from existing documents or electronic medical forms and such. For example, a researcher can pull information from the patient's medical record, and this would be collecting documents or records from an existing source. Using the documents and the records can be a very efficient and inexpensive way to do your research, because you're predominantly using research that's already been completed or information that's already been collected. However, because you have a lot less control over the results than the documents and records, the data can very often be incomplete, and there's no going back and getting verification on the data. So this can be really tough on how you're going to answer things if the data doesn't provide you with the answers you need. You could also use a method called focus groups, which is kind of a combination of an interview, surveying, and observation. And in this case, you would have several individuals come together and talk about something they have in common. And the purpose of a focus group is to add a collective element to the individual data collected. So focus groups are often open-ended questions, and they require some type of group moderator that can ask the group to think back on their shared experiences rather than forward to the future. So open-ended questions ground the research in a particular state of mind, and they eliminate external interference. The last type of data collection method that we're going to talk about right now is questionnaires and surveys. These are closed-ended answers that are directly taken from the participant. The data is gathered and analyzed in many different ways, and you can assign numerical values for the data to speed up your analysis. This can be very useful for collecting a large number of data or on a large population. But in order for it to be meaningful, the surveys and the questionnaires really need to be carefully planned out and validated. Unlike an interview where the researcher can react to the direction of the respondent's answers, a poorly designed questionnaire will lead the study nowhere quickly. While surveys are often less expensive than interviews, they won't be valuable if they aren't designed correctly. So surveys can be conducted as interviews, but in most cases it makes sense to conduct a survey using forms. I have here a table that tells you all about these different types of forms, what their purposes is, advantages to them, challenges, and what your research capacity would be required to utilize this particular method. This table could be very helpful for when it comes time for you to decide how you're collecting your own research later. When you're talking about applying data collection methods to REDCap, you're really talking about utilizing what's called a data form or a survey mode. In a data form, this is where a researcher or somebody on the study team logs directly into REDCap and they capture the data themselves. The information is stored in a unique record inside the database. When you're in survey mode, the person that's inputting the information is the participant. It's the same questions, but it looks a little different. It's got a pretty web interface. The participant puts the information into the form, and the survey is connected and stored to a unique record in the database. I have videos, a link here for videos for you to watch all about setting up a single survey project. There are different types of fields that are inside REDCap. I'm going to give you the list of what each of the field types are. Later on, we're going to learn a little bit more in depth what each of these fields are. So for now, this is more of a broad overview of the different field types. One option is a text field. This is where you have a single line text box. You could have a notes field, which is a large text box with lots of text. You can have a drop-down box and a radio box. Both of these are multiple choice with a single response option, or a checkbox, which is a multiple choice with a multiple selection option. There is a file upload field, which can capture anything from a signature to an audio file to a video file, or even a picture or a document. There's calculated fields where you can perform real-time calculations. You can have what's called a dynamic SQL field. This is a special request field, but in this one, you can have a query statement pre-populate some of the drop-down options. So you would use this field for talking to another database project that's, so you would query another project, and then you would have all of the options in that column be in your row. It's not very commonly used. Another field type is a descriptive field. In this one, the text displays something you might want to give information. So this could be like a video, a YouTube video, or a picture that you might want to show. It could be directions. What you're looking at right now is a descriptive field where there are lots of information inside a field with no response that is captured. You could also have what's called a slider field. This is a visual analog score. It's automatically a 0 to 100, and you can identify what you want the different components within that 0 to 100 score to be. You can have a yes-no field, which is a binary radio button with one choice, either yes or no, and a true-false field, which is also binary with either true or false options. And I have a link here with a video that talks about the different project field types and shows you examples. And this ends Module 2. At this point, you're going to want to go and complete your Module 2 assignment.